published in 2008 called 1948, which was a sort of a summary of the war, its various parts, its battles, the political side of the war, the refugee problem or problems, and so on. And what I'm going to give you here is essentially some of the main points I reached in the conclusion to that book, the book 1948, which was published in 2008 by Yale. Some of the conclusions are controversial, some of them are rejected by some historians or by many historians. Others are more conventional. I'll give you I'll talk about a number of conclusions. Firstly, the nature of the 48 war. And here there's a subject which historians have found controversial. Avi Schleim, who taught at this university, objected to part of this conclusion, as did Yoav Gelber, who taught in Haifa University, is a sort of one of Israel's senior military historians. The nature of the 48 war. The war conventionally has been seen and written about by journalists and by historians as a war between two national movements and states following the establishment of Israel in 1948, and the surrounding Arab states and the ethnic group called the Palestinian Arabs in Palestine. A conventional political war over territory. Unusual, incidentally, as national wars go between states or ethnic groups, in that both sides, to a degree, certainly the Palestinians unanimously, but on the Israeli side to a great degree, the war was over the whole, in terms of its, as a political war, was over the whole of the territory. Unlike national or ethnic wars, which are usually about borderlands, Alsace-Lorraine between Germany and France, the two countries fought wars in part about these borderlands, who would take them, they took them, they gave them back, and so on. That's what usually national wars between national groups are about. The 48 war, as a political war, was unusual in the sense that, certainly from the Palestinian side, they wanted all of Palestine, not parts of Palestine, or a little chunk of this or a little chunk of that, but they fought over the whole of Palestine. And to some degree, so did the Jews. They saw Palestine as their ancient land, the land of Israel, and they wanted, at least initially, the whole, the Zionist movement, the whole of Palestine as its patrimony and as its legitimate and, deserved patrimony. So this is unusual as a national war, but that's if it's seen as a national political war, which it was in part. What I've added to that, and this is on the basis of the research I did for the book 1948, which came out in 2008, I pointed out that the war was also a religious war, certainly from the Arab side, a jihad. They were waging jihad against the Jewish Zionists who are seen as infidels, and were fighting over what they regarded as sacred territory, and were being egged on to this, if you like, by Allah and by his representatives on earth, the priesthood, the Arab Muslim priesthood, not just the Palestinian Arab Muslim priesthood. It's a bit difficult to define what is a war, what is a jihad, in the sense that, does it mean a war in which all the participants, at least on one side, believe that they are in jihad? Do all the Arab populace in the various Arab countries, the foot soldiers from the various countries, etc., or does it mean the leaderships of the countries think they're going to jihad? Is that sufficient to call a war a jihad? Or the priests from various, one side, is that sufficient to give that definition to that war? So there is a problem here, and I readily agree or admit to the fact that there's a problem here in defining, was it a jihad? How do you define it as a war of jihad, or what made it a war of jihad? We don't have, the Arab states famously have never been and still are not, of course, democracies. There are no public opinion polls. We don't know what exactly the populace in Egypt, in Cairo, in Damascus, in Ramallah, what the populace and what the soldiers actually thought they were fighting for. We don't know that. There's no, as I say, no opinion polls, no democracy, no votes, no very few diaries or anything of that sort left behind. We're talking about a largely illiterate population in the Arab countries at the time. They didn't leave documents for us to read. And the Arab governments, of course, have all closed their documents if they kept them. All Arab archives, as you may or may not know, are closed. for the modern period. Maybe you've got some municipal records from Egypt, from Cairo for 1920, but you don't have the documents of the Arab governments open in any Arab country, not Jordan, not Syria, not Egypt, and so on. So there's a problem with Arab sources in documenting whether this was, or deciding whether this was a jihad or not. We don't have the documents.
What about survivors?
Sorry?
What about survivors?
What about?
Survivors.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Survivors.
Veterans.
Veterans from the war. Well, they've never been interviewed. I haven't interviewed them. We're talking about a war which happened 70 years ago. So now they would be 90 or 95 or 100 or dead, mostly dead. So I haven't interviewed people, and also memories about what people thought 70 years ago. Were they involved in jihad, or did they go for personal reasons? Memories after 70 years or 50 years or whatever are also not really dependable, at least in the historiographic community to which I belong. I rely on documents. That's how I work. What I can say is this. I believe, and I've written in the conclusion to the study in 1948, that jihad, that is a religious impulse, was at work on the Arab side in going to war by the Palestinians and by the Arab states. How do I know that? Well, there are some documents that are British diplomatic reports from Arab countries, the statements in the press by Arab leaders, which did appear, as I say, in the absence of actual archives. On the 2nd of December 1947, 3 or 4 days after the United Nations had voted to partition Palestine into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish, on the 2nd of December 1947, the ulama of Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University is the oldest university in the Arab world, one of the oldest in the world. It's ulama, it's a council of theologians or wise men who interpret what the Quran means or what it should mean in terms of daily life and politics and so on. The ulama of Al-Azhar, which is probably the most authoritative interpreter of Islam in the Sunni Arab world, which is the majority of the Muslim world in the Arab countries. The minority are the Shiites, majority are Sunnis. The most important interpreter of Islam and what God wants on earth is Al-Azhar University's ulama. On the 2nd of December 1947, they issued a fatwa, a religious ruling. The ulama of Al-Azhar University issued a fatwa, which is a religious ruling that is telling what is the will of the religion, of their God, if you like, of Allah. And they reissued, incidentally, the fatwa again in April 48 and reissued it for a 3rd time, the ulama of Al-Azhar, in December 48, by which time the war was lost already for the Arab side. They lost the war, but still they felt the need to reiterate that this is a jihad, meaning that even for future generations or future years, we've lost this round, but we will fight again, we will continue this jihad. And in that fatwa they said it is the duty of all Muslims around the world to join this war, to come if they're able-bodied and male and so on, to fight in the war, and if not, to send money for the cause to destroy the Zionist enterprise, to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, our sacred soil. Now this religious ruling by the ulama of Al-Azhar, and it still needs to be checked much more by researchers, was repeated on various in various mosques, preachers and so on around the Arab world as the voice of the religion, the voice of God, if you like, what God wants Muslims to do. Mati al-Muranam, a Christian Arab woman from Beirut who had married a Palestinian Arab and in 1947-48 was the head of the women's organization of the Arab Higher Committee. The Arab Higher Committee was the governing body, so it could be called, or the leadership body of the Palestinian Arab National Movement. It was headed by a man called Haj Amin al-Husseini, often called the Mufti. It had a very small women's organization called the Women's Organization. And this Mati al-Muranam, a Christian woman from Lebanon who had married a Palestinian Muslim in Jerusalem, she was the head of this women's organization, and she gave an interview in January 1948, 2 months into the Civil War, part of the 48 war. And she said in this interview, "The UN decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred. The reference, of course, to the Crusaders is important because by then already in Arab political imagery, the Zionists were compared to the Crusaders. They were foreigners invading an Arab land, and their fate would be the same. The Crusaders, as you know, were expelled by the Arabs, Saladin and so on, in the 12th century, 13th century. So this was the comparison she was making, but she was also saying, and she was a Christian, she never disavowed her religion, but she said the Arabs have accepted this as a holy war, that's what's going to be waged, and the Jews have no chance of winning it. Following the 15th of May 1940 invasion by the Arab states' armies of Palestine, the attack against the newborn state of Israel, the Saudi regime organized what were called jihadi festivals around the various oases, or what became towns, of Saudi Arabia. And 2,000 people registered to go fight in Palestine. I don't actually know how many arrived on the battlefield, but thousands registered. And it was reported by British diplomats writing from Riyadh or wherever it was, that 200,000 are ready to perform jihad and sacrifice their lives. So Saudi officials told British diplomats. And we know also that thousands did volunteer for jihad from around the Arab world, especially we know from North Africa, from the Maghreb, from Morocco, Algeria, and made their way across the deserts. It wasn't as easy to travel to jihad then as it is today. You can't just hop on a plane and go to Syria and kill people. You have to cross a whole northern Africa to get there, and it wasn't that easy, and the British were in control of the roads, basically, to the Suez Canal, so many of these Maghrebi volunteers for the war in 48 didn't actually make it. They were interned by the British and the Egyptians in Egypt, and eventually there was even riots in the internment camps, and eventually the British and the French sent them back to, most of them, to Morocco and Algeria. But the important point is, volunteers did arrive heeding this call for jihad, as did incidentally hundreds of volunteers apparently from Bosnia, which there are Muslims in Bosnia, as we know, and they also, for various reasons, maybe mainly jihad, came to fight. So what I'm saying is, in my look at the documentation from 48, from the war, 47, 48, 49, I did come across quite a lot of jihad as the motive, or one of the major driving forces in the Arab attack, Palestinian initially, pan-Arab later on, against the Zionist enterprise Israel in the 48 war. More work needs to be done on this. One would have to, and as I say, the Arab archives are closed, but you'd have to go through the newspapers around the Arab world. Some of them reported what preachers were saying in their sermons, in the mosques and so on, what politicians were saying around the Arab world, and maybe one would get a better handle on this, whether it was jihad and whether it was seen as jihad by the publics, or at least the political elites in the various Arab countries. From what I saw, many Arabs did believe it was jihad. Even the most moderate of the Arab leaders going to war in 48, we can talk about him later, and that was Abdullah, the king of Jordan. Even he, as his army was about to cross the bridge, the Arab Legion, the Jordanian army was about to cross the bridge on the 14th, 15th of May into Palestine to fight the Jews, even he said to his troops, maybe cognizant of how his troops felt about what they were going to battle for, he said to them, many of you will die, but you will become martyrs, and the rest of you will, of course, remember this is a great day, and so on and so forth. But he spoke in jihadi terms, martyrdom, shuhada, and so on. That's how he talked to his soldiers. And he was one who was very reluctant to go to war, and in fact waged it with very half-heartedly, with his arms behind, his hands behind his back. We can talk about Jordan's special role in this war. It was a very unusual role, but he sort of gave himself to this rhetoric, this jihadi rhetoric, as they were going to war. A second subject I dealt with in the conclusion of 1948 was the war aims of the various sides in the war, and then you must look at the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, and its leadership before the State of Israel was declared in May 48, and its foes, its antagonists, the Palestinian Arabs. And there you have a problem because most of the leadership is already abroad during that war. It's in exile by the British, self-exile, whatever, before the war breaks out. and you have no actual state, there's no Palestinian Arab state. The Jewish community is very well organized, you've got leadership, you know what their war aims are, but on the Palestinian side it's a bit more diffuse, much more difficult to put the finger on exactly what were they going to war for, the Palestinian Arabs. And you've got to look at the state of Israel after the 15th of May 1948, what its war aims were in the war against the Arab invading armies and the Arab states, and what of course were the war aims of the Arab states once they went into invasion on the 15th of May until January 49. So you've got a number of different parties in the conflict. You've got to look at their war aims in the two parts of the war, which are a bit different. On the Jewish side, it's fairly clear. We also have the documentation, which is pretty clear about what the war aims were of the Jewish side in the two parts of the war, against the Palestinians and then against the Arab states. The war aim on the Jewish side was constant. The main war aim, I found three war aims. The main foremost primary war aim of the Jewish side in both parts of the war was clearly survival. They were fighting the Arabs in order to survive the Arab assaults, the Palestinian militias assaults initially, then the Arab states assaults on the new born state of Israel. Survival, that's clearly the first thing, and I don't think that any historian would dispute this. Let me add one thing going back a second, but then I'll get back to this. The identification of the 48 war as a jihad on the Arab side is controversial. There are historians who reject that. They say it was a political ethnic war. People may have spoken in the language of jihad, but it wasn't really what was in their hearts and what was driving them. It was rhetoric. The same as Sadat when he comes to Jerusalem in 1977 on his famous speech to the Knesset. He says, Bism Allah. He begins with, I'm speaking in the name of Allah, whereas the speech, of course, was highly political. It wasn't really religious, but so maybe people used this rhetoric in 48 as well. The second thing I should say, before going on to the war aims, when talking about the jihad, was on the Jewish side, the war was not a religious war. The 48 war was not a religious war. How do I know that? From everything which is written in the documentation, in the newspapers, etc. The Jewish population of Palestine, and here you have a problem of looking at things from 2016 backwards, the Jewish population of Palestine in 1947-48 was 90+% secular. It's not today. Today maybe 30% of Israelis are religious of one denomination or another, and 10 or 15% are ultra-Orthodox. But at the time, the Orthodox were less than 1%, and the national, what is called national religions today, were also something like 5, 6, 7%. Very small part of the population. Not only were they demographically insignificant, but they were politically even more insignificant, because the leadership of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, and of the state of Israel when it emerged, was completely secular. They may have had one or two religious ministers there, because you had to encompass as many as you could in a coalition, but they carried no weight. The prime minister, the defense minister, the foreign minister, all the important ministries were secular people, and the Zionist enterprise in general was a revolutionary secular enterprise against the world of their fathers and forefathers, which was a religious world. That is, they fled the homes of their parents and became secular political Jews, these Zionists like Ben Gurion, Sharet, and so on, who founded and eventually the movement and eventually founded the State of Israel and led it in this 48 war. The Zionist side, it was a secular war. Maybe there was some fringe of 1 or 2% who talked in godly terms, but that was unimportant, insignificant, demographically completely insignificant, politically also. So. As to the war aims, getting back to the war aims. I said the first primary war aim on the Zionist side, and it's clear, there's no disputing it, no historian disputes that, was survival. Survival in both parts of the war. Surviving the Palestinian assault, surviving the political, that is the attack by the Arab armies and the Arab states on the 15th of May. It's one war with two parts.
Parts happening simultaneously?
No, I said one is from November until mid-May 48. That's the Palestinian assault on the Jewish community, and the Jewish community eventually beating them. And the second part is the assault by Arab armies who actually crossed the international frontiers on the 15th of May 1948. And that war lasts until January 1949. by 15th of May 48, maybe I should have said that, the Palestinians have been thoroughly defeated. They're no longer participants in the war. The war is between the new state of Israel and its army, and the armies of the Arab states who have just invaded. The Jewish side had two further war aims which accrued in the course of the war. I don't think they were there necessarily in November, December 47 when the war begins, but they accrued, the first one being expansion of the territory to become a Jewish state beyond the borders allotted by the United Nations in the partition plan. The UN partition plan of November 47 allocated for Jewish statehood something like 55% of the land mass of Palestine, the area ruled by the British Mandate. That was Palestine, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean. The UN said the Jews should have 55% of it. The Arabs should have 43%, and maybe 2% was to be left for international control, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, but the rest was to become Arab. The Jews, in the course of the war, in March, April 48, after being assaulted for 3-4 months by the Palestinian Arab militias, said, well, they want war, we'll give them war, and we need more territory because this isn't sufficient for our needs, or strategically it's problematic. The borders assigned to us by the United Nations, we will improve them for security reasons, also for other reasons of development, expansion, and so on. And from March, April 1948, the Jewish side begins to expand beyond the partition borders, beyond what the United Nations had allotted for Jewish sovereignty in their plan. And by the end of the war, instead of 6,000 square miles of the territory of Palestine, which had been allotted by the United Nations for Jewish sovereignty, the state of Israel emerged with 8,000 square miles. Still a very small territory. It's like the size of New Jersey or something, but or maybe smaller, New Hampshire, whatever. But 8,000 square miles, 2,000 square miles were added to the territory allotted by the United Nations at the expense of the area which was to have become the Palestinian Arab state. This accrued to the Zionists, to the Jewish side. So this was clearly a war, and this didn't happen just as a result of battle. It happened because that's what the Zionist leadership wanted, a larger state with a little better borders. The third war aim of the Zionist side, which is controversial in the sense that there are people who disagree with me on this point, is that they wanted a state. From March, April, it becomes a war aim, even though not formally stated and not an official policy, not publicly stated, but they want a state with less Arabs, or as few Arabs as possible. In other words, the state of Israel, as construed by the United Nations partition plan, was supposed to have something like 500,000 Jews and 400,000 Arabs. There were another 100,000 Jews living in Jerusalem, which was UN territory. But in the Jewish state, there was supposed to be 500,000 Jews and 400,000 Arabs. The Arabs had gone to war against the Jews. They didn't want this partition of the country. And the Zionist side felt, well, if they want war, we'll give them war. And B, we can't leave such a large Arab minority inside the Jewish state because they just fought against us. They will continue to be disloyal citizens, and we will destabilize the state demographically, terrorism, politically, whatever you want. We want less Arabs in the state. This was the line of Ben Gurion. This was the line of the first president of the state of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. They wanted as few Arabs as possible to remain in the Jewish state at the end of the war. And though it never became official policy, no major party in the Jewish community made it part of the party platform. It wasn't Mapai, it wasn't even the right wing's party, the revisionists. It wasn't part of the platform of any party or of the state itself, of the Jewish agency executive, or of the government of the state of Israel. It became sort of semi-official policy of the government and the army, and in most places, in many places, the Jewish troops made sure that Arabs would not stay behind in the area of the Jewish state. It wasn't formal, official, consensual policy in the sense that there was a party which was opposed to a party in the government, in the coalition, which was opposed, Mapam, and the army didn't act in one voice on this subject, so a large number of Arabs actually remained in the Jewish state at the end of the war, 160,000 as compared to 700,000 Jews. You could say it's only a fifth, but it's still a large minority stayed behind, were left behind, and today are the basis of Israel's large Arab-Israeli minority of 1.5 million or whatever it is today. But I think it was in some way unofficial warring of the Jewish side, especially of its leaders, led by Ben Gurion and the army staff. Initially, as I say, for security reasons, the army wanted as few Arabs behind, because if you leave Arab villages behind, you've got to man them, you've got to garrison them. We don't have the troops for it, as we're facing on the borders invading Arab armies. We want our backs clean. We don't want people sniping at convoys or food supplies and so on. So it had a good security reason for it, but also to it accrued demographic and political thinking. As the time passed, we don't want Arabs, or a large number of Arabs, in the state, because this will be demographically and politically destabilizing, militarily down the road as well. So that's a third warring of the Jewish side. Those are the three warrings. As I said, the first is clear, the second one is fairly clear, the third one is controversial in terms of some historians, at least our historians, like the late Shabtai Tevet, Ben Gurion's biographer, Anita Shapira, who is a veteran Zionist historian, who dispute that this was the will of the Zionist leaders in the 48 war. I disagree with it. The Arab side, well, as I say, the Palestinians had no real, they had no government. And the leadership of the Palestinians, most of the members of the Palestinian Arab Higher Committee were outside the country, including their leader. They lived in Cairo during the war. And they didn't produce, paperwork, documentation like a government does. So it's not that clear what the Palestinians wanted in the war. Without doubt, in launching hostilities in November, December 47, they wanted to abort the implementation of the United Nations partition resolution. They wanted anarchy and chaos to reign in Palestine so that a Jewish state wouldn't come into being, the resolution of the UN would not be implemented. This is clear from the Palestinian side by their actions, but as I say, we don't actually have the documentation to prove it because it wasn't produced. We have hints of it in various diplomatic cables by the British, by Americans, by French, and so on, coming out of Palestine or from the area around. The Arab states' war aims, Israelis said, let me add, in addition to that about the Palestinians, this also applies to the Arab states themselves. Israelis later said the Palestinians and the Arab states wanted, or their war aim was, to throw the Jews into the sea. That was the phrase which eventually took hold in Zionist Israeli propaganda and so on, and actually accepted by most of the world. This was what the Palestinians and Arab states had intended in attacking the Jewish state. The problem with this is that the Palestinian leaders, when they gave interviews in the first half of 48, when they were running this guerrilla war against the Jews, didn't actually use that phrase. They didn't say we want to throw the Jews into the sea. This was not publicly stated by them, as far as we know, within circles which reached British diplomats or newspapers where it became public. They were very careful, and this is true about the Arab leaders themselves from outside. King Farouk of Egypt, King Abdullah of Jordan, and others. They didn't use the phrase, we want to throw the Jews into the sea. It was only used once, as far as I've been able to trace, by an important Arab leader, and this was Abdul Rahman Azam, who was the Secretary General of the Arab League, which was the League of Arab States, which in a sense he represented the government's consensus, the Arab League Secretary General. And he did say, on the eve of the Pan-Arab invasion of mid-May 1948, he told the British ambassador in Amman, a man called Kirkbride, he said to him, and Kirkbride recorded this in his memoirs, written shortly afterwards, we will throw the Jews into the sea within a fortnight. The war's going to be over within a fortnight. We'll throw the Jews into the sea. But this is rare. The other Arab leaders did not express themselves in this way. It is not found in British diplomatic reports after conversations with Arab leaders or in public statements printed in newspapers. You don't find that phrase. Rather the opposite. The Arab leaders were very careful to say, don't forget they were violating a United Nations resolution, a partition resolution, which endorsed the establishment of a Jewish state. If they had said, well, we're going there to throw the Jews into the sea, or to destroy the Zionist state, they would be in conflict with the United Nations and with its Security Council. So what they usually said was, and this is what the Foreign Ministry of Egypt announced on the day of the invasion, on the 15th of May 1948, we are going in to save our Palestinian brothers who are being massacred by the Jews, which isn't really true, but this is what they told the world, and that's why we're going in there, for a positive reason, to save people, not for a negative reason, to destroy Jews. It could be the Arab leaders thought in terms of destroying the Jews. It could be they told their generals, destroy the Jews, but we don't have the records for it, and they may not have done that. It could also be that they didn't say this to their generals as they were sending them to battle, but it could be that that would have been the ultimate upshot of the war had the Arab states won. In other words, had the Arab armies of Egypt and Syria and so on reached Tel Aviv, it's possible they would have massacred the Jews. It's quite possible Arab leaders would have thought this is what would happen. We don't have to say it. It's going to happen if we conquer, if we win this war. And there's no point in saying it if we don't win the war. So, but it wasn't stated. It's not found in the records which exist for the 48 war. One day, maybe the Egyptians or the Syrians will open their records and we'll find statements like that, but we don't have them. They don't exist at the moment in what's open.
Yeah. It's clearly stated that the Jews believed that they were threatened.
Oh yes, no, maybe that's an important point I should say. The Jews believed that they were in for a second Holocaust. The Jews, this is 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, and the Jews did feel that the Arabs intended to destroy them and their state, and they fought with their backs against the wall literally because behind them was the Mediterranean. They occupied 10, 20 miles inland, but essentially they were with their backs to the water. And if they were destroyed, they would be thrown into the sea. That's how the Jews felt, given what had happened in Europe 3 years before, in which the world didn't come and save them. This incidentally is one of the reasons the Americans did not support the Zionist declaration of statehood before it happened. In early May 1948, the Americans tried to persuade the Jews not to declare statehood because they feared that what would happen is the Jews would lose the war. That was the CIA and the British evaluation of what's going to happen if the Arab states invade, and therefore America would be forced to send troops to save the Jews. And this Truman and General Marshall, who was his Secretary of State, did not want to happen, so they opposed the establishment of the Jewish state. Once, of course, the Jews declared statehood, the Americans were the first to recognize the establishment of Israel and recognize the government of Israel. But in any case, that's about war aims. We can talk more. Let me add one more sentence to this.
We're going to take questions after that, then we finish the lecture.
There was a fly in the ointment on the Arab states' side, and that is that the Jordanians, under King Abdullah, and they had the best of the Arab armies. In fact, the best of the armies in the 48 war was the Jordanian Arab Legion, the Jordanian army. The problem with the Arab Legion was it numbered 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 troops. It grew to about 14,000 by the end of the war, but it was a very small army. And it couldn't actually invade West Jerusalem and then invade Tel Aviv. We're talking about big cities in terms of this size of an army. And Abdullah understood that they can't. He also thought the Arab armies were no good, all the other Arab armies. And the Jordanian Legion, which was led by British officers, was very small. So he figured the Jews are going to win the war, Abdullah. But when the Arab states decided to invade, he couldn't be the traitor and stand out and say, I'm not going to fight in this war. So he sent in his army, but with the intention of not attacking the Jewish state, but taking over the West Bank and eventually also East Jerusalem. Arab East Jerusalem, which was supposed to be United Nations territory as part of Jerusalem. So he in effect sent his troops in to occupy what we today call the West Bank, or an expanded West Bank, up to Lida, Ramle, and Latrun. That was the area intended to occupy. What happened though was when he occupied Latrun, Lida, Ramle, he actually severed the road between Tel Aviv and the Jewish population in West Jerusalem and forced the Jews to break open the road, which meant fighting the Arab Legion. And that's what happened. So there were big battles between Israel and Jordan on the road to Jerusalem and around the old city of Jerusalem and around Jerusalem in general, but not because either side really wanted that war. The Jordanians certainly didn't want to fight against the Israelis, because as I say, Abdullah figured the Jews are going to win anyhow. So there's no point in us joining in, but he ended up fighting the Jews. But the Jordanians more or less made it clear to the Arab brothers, we're not going to fight the Jews. we were going in to occupy the area allotted to the Arabs, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, which wasn't allotted, but was full of Arab population, but we're not going to fight the Jews. They ended up fighting the Jews, that's what happened. But that's war. Wars, things happen in wars almost always, which are never intended. But that's how wars are, what happens in wars. I want to talk about two other subjects which I discussed in the conclusion. One of them is the refugee problems caused by the 48 war, and I use the plural knowingly. The war caused 3 refugee problems. The first was small, 70,000 of the Jews in Palestine. There were 700,000 Jews in Palestine in May 48. 70,000 of them, which is 10%, which is quite a large chunk of 700,000, were displaced and uprooted by the war. Women and children sent back to Tel Aviv or wherever from frontline kibbutzim, Jews thrown out of the old city of Jerusalem by the Arab Legion. When it conquered the old city, the Etzion bloc was conquered by the Arab Legion, and their population was removed. So 70,000 Jews were forced out of their homes, uprooted from their homes in the course of the war. Israel won the war, also reconquered some of the territory from which the Jews had been uprooted in some way. So most of the 70,000 simply went back to their homes or to other homes in the same area by the end of the war, and there was no Jewish refugee problem from the 48 war, no Jewish Israeli refugee problem. The 70,000 basically went home, except for some settlers from the old city or some settlers from the Etzion bloc in the West Bank, and they set up new kibbutzim, and they were okay. They had a place to live, work and study and so on. So that problem vanished. The second problem caused by the war, and we can talk about it more later if you want to ask questions about it, that is a book which I devoted a number, is a subject which I devoted a number of books to, is the Palestinian Arab refugee problem. 700,000 Arabs approximately, nobody knows the real number, but it's probably somewhere around 700,000, were displaced from their homes, most of them to other parts of Palestine, not out of Palestine, most of them to other parts of Palestine, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, in the course of the war. They were uprooted from their homes and moved somewhere else and became what are called refugees. And the United Nations recognizes them and their children, grandchildren, and progeny down to the end of time, essentially, as refugees. So today on the United Nations rolls, there are something like 5.5 million Palestinian refugees. It's the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and those who survived of the original 700,000, which is, of course, a small number.
Special agency was established.
Yes, a special agency was established by the United Nations, UNRWA, to take care of, to finance, to feed, to educate, and so on, the refugees, these 700,000 refugees and their descendants.
Is there another refugee?
Well, one second, let me finish. I'm
We're gonna have questions after.
right in the middle.
Please.
The refugee problem, I'll just say it in a sentence, but if you want, we can ask questions about it, and as I say, that's something I have worked on. Essentially were the result, the 700,000 Palestinian refugees were essentially the result of a war which they themselves had launched. And in the course of the fighting and so on, they were uprooted from their homes. This was a tactical and a strategic necessity by the Israeli troops who were fighting for their lives at the time, later less for their lives, but also in terms of the future vision of what Israel should look like. They were uprooted by the Israeli troops one way or another. Most of them simply fled because they didn't want to be hit by the battles, but weren't allowed to return to their homes by the Israelis. So in that sense, they are the result of an expulsion, even though very few of them were actually expelled by Israeli troops. Most of them simply fled, and then later were not allowed back to their homes by the Israelis, weren't allowed back into the state of Israel following the war. As I say, we can talk more about this if you like later. That refugee problem remains and is a major, probably the most contentious, most important bone of contention between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and the Arab world. What to do with these refugees who, as I say, now number 5.5 million. And returning 5.5 million to their places which no longer exist, have turned into Israeli villages, Israeli towns. Most of the houses were destroyed, the lands were apportioned to the kibbutzim. Their return is something which Israelis cannot countenance, cannot never agree to, and basically it'll be the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, because returning 5 million refugees to a state which has 6 million Jews and 1.5 million Arabs as it stands means no longer a Jewish majority state, means no longer a Jewish state. Israelis since 48 have consistently, Israeli governments have consistently said no to a Palestinian mass refugee return. That's Israeli policy, consistent in all Zionist parties, not just right or left, it's everybody, no Palestinian refugee return. Equally adamant have been the Palestinians who've said this must be part of an agreement, there must be the right of return as they call it. The Palestinians must be allowed to go home to their places. Some of them say they won't return, it's only on paper, but who knows if they're allowed to return. Maybe a lot of them will pack up from their refugee camps. They live in misery and poverty in Lebanon, they live in misery and poverty in Syria, they have no state, they haven't been given citizenship in these countries. There's over 1 million there. There's another 1 million or 2 million or 3 million in Jordan, where they live as second-class citizens. They will want to return, and this is what they demand as part of their policy. That is, Palestinian policy is there must be a right of return and implementation of the right of return. The third refugee problem created by the war wasn't created so much in 48 as during the following years, and that's the displacement of the Jewish communities from the Arab lands. There were large Jewish communities in the Arab countries, in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, large Jewish communities, 300,000 or so in Morocco, 130,000 in Iraq, 70,000 in Yemen, 40, 50,000 in Egypt, the same sort of numbers in Syria and Libya. All of these communities were eventually displaced from their countries and from their homes, all their possessions confiscated by the Arab governments, much like the possessions, lands and houses of the Palestinians who were displaced in the 48 war from Palestine or from their areas in Palestine. All of these were displaced. The number probably displaced of Jews from Arab lands is probably about 800,000. In other words, slightly more than Palestinians displaced from their homes in the course of the 48 war. They were displaced over about 15, 20 years, from 48 until about mid-60s. Gradually, communities were uprooted from, initially from Yemen, some from Egypt, Iraq 1950, Syria 1949, 50, eventually North Africa, which was occupied by the French. When the French began to leave in the mid-50s, the Jews from these countries, Morocco, which had a very large community, began to leave. And by 64, almost all the Jews from Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Egypt, had been displaced. Why were they displaced? How were they displaced? Essentially, it's a story of intimidation. There weren't, in almost no cases, was there an order of expulsion by the Arab governments to their Jews to leave the country. They weren't ordered out, usually. In Egypt, this did happen in 56. Those Jews remaining were actually expelled from Port Said. But in most countries, they weren't expelled, but they were displaced as a result of intimidation. What does that mean? It means the societies in which they lived, the Arab Muslims among whom they lived, told them, go, get out. We want your houses, we'll burn them down, we will burn you down if you don't leave. The governments of Iraq, Egypt, and some other governments intimidated the Jews as policy. They arrested thousands in Iraq and in Egypt in 48, 49. The Jews were seen as a potential fifth column by the Arab states because supposedly they supported Zionism. They didn't actually. They weren't very great Zionists. They didn't come to Palestine before 48. After 48, because they had to leave, they ended up, most of them, in Palestine, or what became the new state of Israel. But they weren't Zionists, but the Arab government suspected they would support Zionism and would do some subversion in their countries. And maybe if they even didn't suspect this, they thought this was a good excuse and a good time to get rid of them and take hold of their property. And this is what happened in Iraq and Egypt, for example. There was terrorism, there was mass arrests of Jews, there were killings of various important leaders in the Jewish community and so on. And so the Jews decided to leave because they were intimidated into flight. So this refugee problem, though, doesn't exist any longer either. Unlike the Palestinian refugee problem, it was solved. Most of the Jews went to Israel. The poor and but most of them were poor, went to Israel. And the rich from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia went to France and prospered there. And the rich Jews from Iraq prospered in England. People like Avi Schleim, that's where his family comes from Iraq, from Baghdad. So they prospered, but Israel absorbed 700,000, 800,000 of these Jews, and they gave them citizenship, gave them eventually housing and education, jobs, and so on, and they turned into normal citizens, even if some sort of ethnic problem did remain among Jews in Israel for decades, and in fact has in some way reawoken in the last few years. We can talk about that also if you want. But essentially they were given the basic rights of citizenship, food, housing, shelter, education, jobs, and so on, and that problem no longer exists. Today you will hear occasionally Arab Jews from Arab lands talking about compensation. These Palestinians want compensation, we also want compensation. So you hear this occasionally, and it does of course make a logical sense. I'll talk just for 5 minutes about one other subject, which, as I say, is among the conclusions in the conclusion of the 1948 war, the book on the 1948 war, and that is about the balance of forces between the two sides, or if you like, between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jews in Palestine before May 48, and between Israel and the Arab states from May 48 onwards in the second part of the war. In 1948, the stronger side won. That's what happened, like it happens in almost every war. The stronger side wins. The question, of course, is what is strength? What makes a society strong or weak, or a state strong or weak? The Jewish side was stronger in the 48 war, both in the first half against the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians outnumbered the Jews in Palestine by 2-1, and Israel was stronger than the Arab states, even though its population was 700,000 compared to the Arab states' tens of millions. Why were they stronger, the Jewish side versus the Palestinians or versus the Arab states? Because the Jews mobilized effectively and efficiently for war, and the Arab side didn't. The Palestinians didn't mobilize properly, they didn't have a proper national movement, and certainly didn't have a national militia. The Jews did, called the Haganah. The Arab armies around were small colonial armies which suddenly grew immediately after the British basically allowed the Egyptians to have an army, or the Iraqis or the Syrians by the French to establish armies. So they were small armies, they weren't properly equipped, they weren't properly led, and they didn't fight very well, actually. Not that there wasn't bravery there, it wasn't just brave Jews fighting, pusillanimous Arabs or something. There was people fought well on both sides, but the Jews were much more efficient. They mobilized their manpower in such a way, just to give you a sort of indication in terms of manpower, and I gave you the proportions in terms of population, which makes, of course, Israel look puny and the Arab states large. In terms of manpower, fighting manpower, that is manpower in armies, the Israeli army numbered by January 49, by the end of the war, 109,000 under arms. Of a population of 700,000 plus, 109,000 were under arms in uniform. On the Arab side, in the theater of Palestine altogether, there were probably something like 60,000 Arab troops. Egyptians, Syrians, Iraqis, Palestinians, the whole lot, maybe 60,000 troops all told. In other words, the Israelis had mobilized properly, maximally for war. The Arab sides hadn't. For them, it was a sort of a minor affair. For the Iraqis, there was a problem of Kurds rebelling continuously in the north. For the Egyptians, the government wasn't very legitimate. There was a monarchy. A lot of Egyptians didn't like. They had to leave a large number of troops to guard the palace in Cairo. You couldn't just send them to Palestine because the mob might throw the king out. So they didn't fight full-heartedly. They also maybe didn't think it would be a big thing. Maybe they thought it would be a quick invasion and they'd win. Maybe they thought we'd invade and the United Nations will step in. They didn't mobilize properly for war, except the Jordanian army. He mobilized, that is the king and his general, Glab Pasha was a British officer. They mobilized properly for war and fought well and were actually victorious in almost every battle they fought against the Israelis, in Jerusalem, around Jerusalem and in Latrun and so on. The other Arab armies didn't mobilize properly and didn't win. The Jewish side had some other major advantages. One of them was the quality of manpower. The Arab states, officers usually, they bought their commissions, they weren't proper soldiers. The Jewish side had a great motivation. The Holocaust had just happened. They were fighting for their lives and their families, who were just behind them. And as I said, they feared massacre, basically. So they had great superior motivation. Iraqi troops, Egyptian troops, they come from Iraq, they come from Egypt. They're not fighting for their lives, they're not fighting for their families. Iraq's not going to be invaded. They'll go back home if they lose, no big deal. Palestinians did have an interest in, but they also didn't think in terms of a potential Holocaust. Somebody's going to destroy them if they lose a war. Maximum, they'll go to the Arab countries. They'll flee the country, which is what a large number of them did. The Jews were better educated. The Arabs generally were uneducated, poorly educated. Many of them were illiterate. The Jews, especially in the technical arms, this was very telling. You know, armor, artillery, communications, intelligence, air warfare, and so on. The Jews were educationally much better and superior in all these branches. The Jews also had a strange, well, they also had a very big monetary advantage. The American Jewish community and other Jewish communities did supply the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, in the course of the war, with $130 million. That's a lot of money in 1948 terms. It's like billions of dollars in aid, which basically fueled the war, made them able to buy weaponry and pay whatever's necessary to manage a war. The Arab side was poor. Today we look at the Arab states, some of them are rich, some of them are poor, but they have a lot of money. Then they didn't have. Even the rich Arab countries at the time didn't enjoy oil royalties like they do today. It was like 3%, not 70% or 80% of the wealth went to them. So they were actually quite poor. And that's also important. Then the last thing is to do with armaments. It's true that on the 15th of May, when the Arab states invaded Palestine, their armies had superior weaponry. They had heavy weaponry. They had tanks, not in large numbers, very small usually, but they had tanks. They had combat aircraft, they had artillery, all of which the Yishuv, because it was a clandestine, that is the Haganah, which was a clandestine force under British rule until the 14th of May, when the British left, it didn't have armor. It couldn't have armor. It was an underground army. So they had rifles, they had machine guns, they had mortars of various calibers, but they didn't really have heavy weaponry. So on the 15th of May, the invading Arab armies, though they were very small, probably the invading forces from all the Arab countries numbered something like 20,000 at most on the 15th of May, and the Haganah at that time probably had 30,000 soldiers in uniform. But the Arab armies had this distinct advantage, and fighting armor and artillery and fighter aircraft in small numbers and not professionally done basically meant sacrificing a lot of lives. Now there's people throwing Molotov cocktails at tanks because they don't have anti-tank guns. Eventually they will get the anti-tank guns. Israel was able, in the course of the months before May 48, to purchase them, not to bring into the country, but to purchase in Czechoslovakia and in other places on the European black market. They were able to purchase large numbers of weapons, but they weren't able to bring them in because the British wouldn't have let them bring them in. So they had a major disadvantage during that the crucial weeks following the 15th of May invasion by the Arab armies. And there you could say it's sort of rifles and Molotov cocktails against tanks and whatever. But within weeks, they brought in the equipment which they'd amassed abroad and were able to sort of counterbalance what the Arabs had in terms of heavy weaponry. And by the end of the war, basically the Zionists had stronger, better heavy weaponry as well, and a stronger army than the Arab armies combined. Yeah, that's basically what
Okay, thanks. So Gil and then Steve.
First, I just want to clarify one theory that you offered, and then I want to ask a question. You mentioned about pushing them into the sea. Is it conceivable, or is there evidence that in order to browse themselves, Israel created that itself? We don't want to be pushed into the sea, rather than the Arabs themselves saying, let's push them into the sea.
No, I understand the question. I think the Israelis genuinely believed, and this is against the backdrop of a destruction of European Jewry, which just occurred, which was also inconceivable. The world's going to allow 6 million Jews to be shipped to gas chambers. Nobody believed that. After 45, they believed if the Arab armies attacked and had the ability to do so, they would massacre the Jews. They spoke like that on the radio. I'm not saying that leaders used those words, but the radio stations all blared massacre and destruction. That's what's coming. So the Jews did believe them. They took them at their word. They couldn't, after the Holocaust, they could not take them at their word. But it's conceivable the Arab leaders didn't think in those terms. It's also conceivable they did think in those terms, but didn't want to say that because that was undiplomatic.
The other thing which I am curious about, if one of the war aims becomes the number 2, namely that if they can get rid of some of the Arab population.
Number 3, as I mentioned.
Yeah. It wouldn't be so terrible because in the course, the army didn't want that many Arabs and so on. So that the notion that if that was indeed a war aimed on the one hand, and on the other hand, Arabs left, they didn't let them back because in fact the war aim was not to reduce that population anyway. So isn't there a consistency there? They wanted them out anyway, they left, they certainly weren't going to let them back in.
Yeah, no, I think there's consistency there. I think you have to think in terms of the 40s and 30s, not in terms of 2016 when you look at this subject. The 1920s, 30s, and 40s had large emigrations and transfers of population and expulsions. This was a norm. This happened in Turkey, it happened post World War I, Turkey vis-a-vis the Greeks, Greeks vis-a-vis the Turks. And in World War II, masses of people, Czechs, Poles, Russians, were moved back and forth. This was sort of, and the Allies did the same thing. They did this to the Sudeten Germans in 1945, and the Volga Germans, the Russians did it, and so on. So the transfers of population in order to make states more uniform demographically would prevent problems of minority problems in the future of the sort which had led to World War I and World War II. The minority problems were among the problems which had generated these world wars. So the Allies and the Russians all understood minority problems are best avoided, and they expelled populations after 45 so that these sort of situations wouldn't recur in Czechoslovakia or elsewhere and so on. And by 48, things hadn't, the mentality hadn't yet changed in a way that said expelling populations is necessarily bad. It may be bad suffering in terms of the first generation, but afterwards it'll solve your long-term problem. The best example is, which was used in 48 by the Zionist side in the 30s and 40s, was the Greek-Turkish problem in World War I, post-World War I, where there had also been an agreed transfer of population towards the end of the expulsion of the Greeks from Turkey. People said, this is solved. There's no war between Turkey and Greece since 1920 or 22 because the minority problem on both sides has vanished. That's what people said in 48 in Israel when they were discussing the problem of the Arab minority. And if you look at the situation, Greece and Turkey incidentally have not gone to war since 1922, since both sides expelled, in the end, their minority populations. Except, of course, in Cyprus, where they fought because the problem hadn't been resolved. There was a minority Turkish population in Cyprus, but apart from Cyprus, Turkey and Greece have not been at war since 1922. So it does solve the problem in some way in the long term. Now this is contrary to the morality of 2016, where you don't transfer populations and you believe in multiculturalism and so on. But this wasn't the world view, the mindset of people in 1945 or 48 in Palestine. To this I would add one other thing. The Palestinians always said that they would expel the Jews from Palestine. This was the policy of the Arab Higher Committee under Husseini in 36, 37, 38, 39. And they said this to the British Royal Commission. That's how we know that this was their policy, even if they didn't say it in public often. They did tell the Royal Commission in 37, when asked, Haj Amin al-Husseini comes and gives testimony to the Royal Commission under Peel. And Peel puts this in his report, so we know what he said. And he says to them, Peel asks him, what's going to happen to the 400,000 Jews in Palestine in 1937? What's going to happen to them if we give the country, Palestine, to the Arabs, to Arab rule? Well, he says, I can't guarantee, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. So the Peel Commission writes in the report, but we have to remember that essentially they hate the Jews, or Haj Amin al-Husseini hates the Jews, and one can expect their fate to be similar to what happened to the Assyrians, a Christian community in Iraq, who were massacred in the 1930s by the Iraqi government, as the British were leaving Iraq, the mandate in Iraq. So essentially, the Palestinian Arabs, their policy was to get the Jews out of Palestine. So I don't think the Jews can really be faulted much for thinking, well, if that's what they want to do to us, and we want to survive, maybe this is what we have to do to them in 48 after they started this war with us. I'm just explaining the background of what goes on. I'm not positing expulsion of populations, but I'm explaining what happened in 48 was necessitated by circumstances, ideological, political, demographic, strategic, and so on. And that's what happened.
So Stephen, before Stephen and David, actually David off the list, just on the footnote, as we heard this morning, there's what, 50 million refugees and 500,000 dead people in Syria. So maybe it's not a thing of the past.
Gil and I evidently think alike. I had a similar question. First of all, thank you for speaking. You're terrific. You advocated, I think, over the years that if you had advised Ben Gurion, you would have said expel the...
I didn't say anything exactly.
Well, I know, I figured I'd be a little controversial. But also, but you can comment on that. In the future, though, I think you may have used words such as if there's an apocalyptic event or an existential threat that we could remove the Palestinians. Can you just comment?
You've sort of paraphrased me. I usually, I said things a bit differently. But what I did say, and I'm quite willing to reiterate what I said. What I said was that had the war ended in 1948 with either all the Jews expelled from Palestine or all the Arabs expelled from Palestine, and by that I mean, say, expelled to Jordan where they would have set up their own state, a Palestinian Arab state in Amman, ruling in Jordan, had either of these things happened, the Middle East would have been a much quieter place. And both the communities, the Jews who had been expelled, or the Arabs who had been expelled, would have had a better life. As it turned out, the populations remained sort of intermixed, which is one of the sources of tension, because the populations don't really live well together. And that was essentially what I said. I did say, as you say, there was an addendum to that, and I did say that were an apocalyptic war in which, I don't know, atomic warfare, Arab states invade Israel, Palestinians are busy shooting at Israeli transports or reinforcements going to the front, I can envision, I didn't say I would support, I said I could envision an expulsion occurring again. That's how I look at it. And I stand by every word I just said.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, because this topic is very important for Russian scholarship and teaching, because in our programs and curriculum and syllabus it's very important to explain the roots of this conflict. But my first question about third base of your research. As you know, as everyone knows, Soviet Union was supported very actively at that time, a partition, and should be very reliable sources. If you refer to sources at that time, it's very short time frame, but the sources were very reliable. And
Soviets
of course,
were,
the approach was made in post-Soviet time by Alexander Boy and some other people.
I don't speak Russian, I don't know anything about Russian archives.
I'm asking not about only you, but my second question is about so-called jihad. You pointed out several times, actually emphasize this idea. What kind of jihad? Like it or jihad? Because at that time, all actually Arabian states, including first of all Egypt, were accepted to the United Nations, yeah?
No. All the Arab states voted against the UN partition plan. All the Arab states.
Members of the United Nations.
Yes, the members of the United Nations, there were several Arab states who were members of the United Nations, and they all voted against the partition plan.
Yeah, but
and then went to war against Israel in May.
What is Al-Azhar? It's just university.
No, it's not just university. I didn't explain it properly. Maybe I should have gone into it more. I'll explain. If you want, I'll explain.
I think it's not enough for courage, special courage for jihad and so on. Because it's a regular university, not more.
I don't know if it's a regular university. It's not exactly one of the top 500, but anyhow, I'm not going into that. It's not a regular university. It's considered a theological. It was originally, initially a theological institute.
It's community. It's not a national level.
No, you don't. You just don't know. It's wrong. Al-Azhar is considered the prime university in the Arab world, the most important university in the Arab world, and it is the most important theologically in the Arab world. And it's, in terms of the Sunni Arab world, it's the place which delivers the most important interpretations of the Quran, about whether you can marry a goy, or whether you can do this or can do that. This is what it does. It gives religious rulings. It's unusual. It's not the situation.
University against the United Nations.
No, not the university against the United Nations. The state of Egypt voted against the UN partition plan, as did the other Arab states, Yemen and so on, who were members of the United Nations. And then in May 1948 they invaded. But they invaded with the imprimatur of the top clerics of their society, who told them this is Allah's will to invade. This is what Allah wants you to do.
Overestimation.
And it's very important because in the Arab world, 90% or plus of the inhabitants, and this is probably truer in 1948 than it is today, then it was probably 99%, are believers. It's not the West, it's not Norway. Not everybody there actually believes. Let me finish my explanation. Let me finish what I'm saying. Most Arabs today in the Arab world are believers. They believe Allah exists. They believe Allah wants people to behave in a certain way, also politically, not just in terms of how they treat their wives. But in 49, when Al-Azhar gives a fatwa and says this is the duty of every Muslim, many Muslims, most of them don't go to war because they don't feel like it or they don't have the ability to, but they think this is what Allah wants, this is what our religion demands of us. It's very important, it's not unimportant. You're thinking in terms of Norway, and this isn't Norway. This is the Arab world in 1948. Now, you asked about Russia. Let me say something about Russia, if we're talking about that. The Russian archives, most of them remain closed, like all dictatorships. They still remain closed. They opened for a very brief period under Gorbachev. Some of the foreign ministry papers were open, and even those, as far as I know, have been closed again, unless you pay very high bribes, as far as I know.
Because I myself use the same manner.
So what I'm saying is correct?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good. What they never opened is the KGB archives. They never opened the presidium of the party.
Even for the ministry archives are closed.
Well, that's today, but they were, for a while, they were open, or some of them were open. In any case, the Russians weren't really involved in the conflict in Palestine. They had a vote, they were able to say things, but they weren't involved like the British who ruled Palestine, the Americans who had agents in Palestine and so on. The Russians weren't involved in the conflict. They were involved, as you said, or implied, in one important way. They were the main arms suppliers through Czechoslovakia of arms to the Yishuv throughout the war, where the Americans boycotted the Zionists and boycotted the state of Israel and wouldn't allow American arms to reach Israel. But the Russians, for reasons of cash, they wanted the Yankee dollars, for reasons of undermining the British presence in the Middle East, they were ready to have supplies reach Israel. So this was very important for Israel in winning the war. This is true. Yeah.
Thank you for excellent talk, and two quick questions. Would you like to elaborate more on the polemic between Professor Gelbert and Abishai?
I'm not sure I know the polemic. What's the polemic?
About this collusion.
Okay.
Okay. And another, how Abishai is nowadays accepted among your community? And maybe your personal opinion on that compensations which are now demanding by representative of one of the refugees from Arabic countries and Europe.
Okay. Look, on the problem of compensation, the Israeli government, I'm not the government spokesman, I've always been very critical of the Israeli government, but on the refugee issue, the Israeli government consistently said no refugee return, but they should be compensated for their lands and houses, which was the essential property which they had. This should be part of any deal. Not a return of refugees, a small return perhaps, but mass return, no, with compensation. This was always, wait one second, this was always Israeli government policy. It very rarely actually mentioned compensation for the Jews from the Arab lands, because it didn't happen exactly simultaneously, so this sort of came later. But nowadays you do occasionally hear Israeli government spokesmen say, well, if there is compensation at the end of the road, if there is ever a peace settlement, which I don't think there will ever be, but if there is a peace settlement, there should be a compensation from both sides, a mutual compensation, and I think that makes sense. Most people I know think that the Jews lost far more property because they had much more property than the Palestinians, the Jews from Arab lands in Baghdad and Cairo and so on. I think compensation should be part of the deal. But as I say, I don't think a deal is going to happen. But there is an argument about collusion. You're right. I forgot about it because it's so long ago. But there is an argument about. I think I sort of stated it when I talked about Jordan being the exception in the Arab world. It didn't really attack Israel in going into Palestine in May '48, though they ended up fighting the Israelis. Avi Schleim, who wrote an important book on the subject called Collusion Across the Jordan, he wasn't the only one, incidentally. There were a number of other scholars. Bar Yosef wrote a book even a year before him, and some other people, Dan Shiftan wrote a book about this. it was clear that the Jordanians were very reluctant to go to war, and when they went to war, were very reluctant to engage in the war, or certainly to attack Israel, and their army actually never crossed the border into the area assigned for Jewish statehood. It crossed into the UN territory, and it went into the territory allotted for Palestinian Arab sovereignty, but not into Israel. And this is clear, but the Israelis, for their reasons, went to war against the Jordanians and tried to capture Jordanian positions in the Palestinian Arab area and in the UN Arab area, UN area. The problem is like this: that why is there an historical dispute about this, or a historiographic dispute on this subject? What exactly was the situation between Jordan and Israel in 47-48? Well, in 1946, Jewish agency representatives, the Jewish agency was essentially the government of the Jewish community in Palestine. Jewish agency representatives in 1946 secretly met with the king of Jordan, Abdullah, who just become a sovereign king. Before that, he was sort of a prince under British protection. But he became a sovereign king, and the Jewish agency representatives went there and said, let's reach a deal in which we will partition Palestine between us. Both sides wanted that. Neither of them wanted Palestinian sovereignty in any part of Palestine. The Jordanians aspired that all of Palestine become part of Jordan. The Israelis said no, the Zionists said no, we want part of Palestine. In the end, sort of reluctantly, the Jordanian king said, okay, let's share Palestine between us. That's what they agreed informally in talks between the Jordanians and the Jewish agency representatives in 46. Move up a year, you reach 1947, and then the United Nations goes ahead and says, yes to partition, but not between Jordan and the Israelis, or the Zionists, but between the Palestinians and the Israelis, something which neither the Jordanians nor the Israelis want, because the Jordanians want all of Palestine, or at least part of it, and the Israelis want part of Palestine between themselves. Neither of them wants Palestinian sovereignty in any part of Palestine. So they sort of enter the war. Golda Meir goes to Jordan in November 1947, just before the UN reaches its decision, and they sort of reiterate the agreement from 46. Let's partition between us. We neither of us like the Palestinians. Abdullah hated Haj Amin al-Husseini. The Israelis had suffered a lot of terrorism from the Palestinians. The Palestinians were up to no good from their point of view. Let's partition between us. But then the UN votes what it votes. The Arab states declare null and void the UN decision and basically move towards going to war. And the Jordanians can't step out of line because they'll be considered traitors. And they can't say, well, we want part of Palestine, because they'll say, what is this? You know, it belongs to the Palestinians. That's what the Arabs would say. So the Jordanians break off contacts with the Israelis, and then Golda Meir goes to save the situation. She's the head of the Jewish agency political department, standing in for the real head, a man called Moshe Sharet, but she's his replacement or whatever in this crucial time. In May 48, the 10th of May 1948, 5 days before the invasion, 4 days before Israel declares statehood, she goes dressed as a man or a woman or something. She goes to Jordan, and she meets Abdullah again. And here Abdullah says to her, I can't say what I said to you back in November. I can't reiterate or endorse our agreement to partition Palestine, because now I'm one of five. That's the phrase he uses. I'm one of five. I'm hemmed in by my Arab colleagues. I can't break ranks. We'll have to go to war, but we'll meet later. That's what he says to her. Because he understands the Jews are going to win. So there is going to be Israel. There's going to be Israeli representatives, and then we'll reach a deal. And then they go fight each other. He invades. They fight each other. The Jews win the war. Jordanians are in the West Bank, and they do actually restart peace negotiations, Israel and Jordan, in 49. Doesn't reach an agreement. Eventually Hussein, Abdullah's grandson, reaches a peace agreement with Israel in 1994, I think it is. They sign a peace agreement. But so the point is, the problem is, was there collusion? That's the question. Was there, as Avi Schleim said, collusion between Israel and the Jordanians going into the 1948 war? And people who say there wasn't say, well, they fought each other. The Israelis had hundreds of dead, the Jordanians had hundreds of dead. Bitter battles in Latrun, bitter battles around Jerusalem, so maybe there was no agreement between them. Those who say there was collusion say, well, look at the end of the war. They actually partitioned Palestine between them. The Jordanians got the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The Israelis got the rest of Palestine, almost, except for the Gaza Strip. So maybe they did collude. So it's sort of up for grabs. Whether they apparently, I put it like this, I would say Abdullah, understanding the limitations of his army, basically agreed to Israel establishing itself and existing where it more or less ended up existing. And the Israelis, partly for lack of strength at the right moments in the war, and partly because they understood that politics, international politics, demanded that they partition Palestine with the Jordanians, also agreed to partition. In March 1949, one of the top Israeli generals, Yigal Allon, goes to Ben Gurion, March 49. They've already won the war, but they haven't yet signed a armistice agreement with the Jordanians. And Allon goes to Ben Gurion in March 49, and he says to him, let me take the West Bank. I can do it in 3 days. My army will march from the Galilee south along the Jordan River. I'll take the West Bank in 3 days. At that time, it would have taken 3 days. The Israeli army, 110,000. Jordanian army, maybe 10, 12,000 strong. No problem. Ben Gurion says to him, no. He says, no, we've done what we can in the war. We've expanded as much as the world will allow us. We can't take the West Bank. England won't allow it. There'll be too many refugees because the refugees knew what happened to them in the previous months. They weren't going to flee the West Bank. The inhabitants and the refugees, they would stay in place. Israel would end up with a large Palestinian Arab population, something which had worked to diminish. So he says no to Allon, and that's it. There's a partition at the end of the war. So was there collusion? Wasn't there collusion? It depends how you look at it. But the war ended with a partition between Israel and Jordan. That's the bottom line.
Okay, so on that note, I